So since this is going to be framed by words, this whole discussion, which
Yes.
is a bit of a controversial thing for the linguistics community to even acknowledge that words exist and stuff. I'm gonna, if you don't know, if this doesn't work out, I'll cut the entire thing out. No one will ever know. But I'm going to read this quote, and I want to see if you can know where it comes from. And if you do know where it comes from, then it will serve as a great paratext for the entire interview to come. Okay, so
Okay.
all right. So okay, words! Exclamation point. Mere words! Exclamation point. How terrible they were! Exclamation point. How clear and vivid and cruel! Exclamation point. One could not escape from them, and yet what a subtle magic there was in them! Exclamation point. They seemed to be able to give a plastic form to formless things, and to have a music of their own as sweet as that of viol or of flute. Mere words! Exclamation point. Was there anything so real as words? Question mark.
Well,
Do you know where this is
it's
from?
definitely literary. It
Yes.
sounds familiar.
I can give you a hint.
Okay, give me a hint.
Okay, hint is art and Oscar Wilde.
Oh, Picture of Dorian Gray?
Yes! Okay, beautiful. Have you read it?
You know what? I read it a long time ago, and my son recently read it for his high school English class.
Yeah, no, it's good, isn't it? Yeah.
The part I liked about that quote is that they give what was it? They give a plastic form to formless things.
They give a plastic form to formless
terrific.
things. I like it, right? Because what is plastic, right? A plastic form to formless things. That's kind of cool.
I like that. Yeah.
I know, right? He's fun. Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I am your host, Talia Sherman, as always. And I'm so excited to bring you today's episode because it's with the incomparable journalist slash public figure slash really smart, nice guy, Ben Zimmer. Ben is a language columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He writes a weekly column called Word on the Street, and it's awesome, and you should read it. But I just want to set aside for like a tiny second all the awesome things about him because I want to give this episode some context. First off, as it seems to be a trend around here, this episode is going to be political through and through, right? At a base level, we know that language is inherently political. Just from hearing me speak right now, the way that I pronounce vowels, the way that I produce consonants, you can tell that I am from a certain place and of a certain age and in a certain time period and with a certain race and a certain ethnicity, etc., etc., etc. But what happens when we turn not to the inherent political properties of language, but to the potential political properties of language? A good example of this for me is that right now, as I'm recording this, about several hundred yards from my dorm room, there are over 100 student protesters at Brown encamping on the main green, protesting a genocide in Gaza. And a central symbol of their movement is the watermelon emoji. And so all the words or signifiers or whatever you want to call it that they're using, whether it's watermelon or divest or ceasefire, these are all indexing political allegiance, wielding political power, and they're seeking to effect political change. And that's all done agentively and deliberately so. So for me, this episode gets at two very important points. The first is that we should think of language semiotically as well as structurally. And the second is that we should be looking at the potential political power in language as well as the inherent political power in language. And as always, this episode was a joy to record and edit and produce, but I cannot really stress enough how much it matters right now that we understand the power of the word. As amorphous or tricky a part of our language it is, right? Linguists don't exactly really know what a word is. It's still really important to acknowledge that words have power, especially as they're being used right now. So please join me in welcoming back into your ears, Ben Zimmer. Ben Zimmer, welcome to the podcast. Hi.
Hi there.
It's so great to be here with you.
Yeah.
You are famous, I guess. One could say.
I don't know about that.
So to start, I suppose, why don't you explain why I said that you're famous? Who are you? What do you do? What's your contribution currently to the world? And why are you doing it?
Who am I? I often ask myself the same question. No, I don't know. I like to describe myself as a linguist, lexicographer, and all-around word nut. I'm a language columnist. For 10 plus years now, I've been writing a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal about words in the news and where they come from. The column's called Word on the Street. I contribute to various other places too, writing about language and words. And I wear various other hats on a kind of, various wordy things that I do. So for instance, I'm chair of the New Words Committee for the American Dialect Society. And in that capacity, I get to oversee the Word of the Year selection process. Always a lot of fun. Also, as part of that, part of a group that does a quarterly feature for the journal American Speech, the Journal of the American Dialect Society, and that feature is called Among the New Words. And so that's another thing that that I enjoy doing. And yeah, various other things. These days, I'm involved with the Scripps National Spelling Bee. They brought me on to work on vocabulary questions where the kids are actually they're asked about the meanings of words, not just the spelling. So yeah, I guess I wear many hats, but yeah, I just often just try to be at the intersection of lots of different wordy pursuits, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you did a great job, always do a great job every year of doing this Word of the Year ceremony at the Linguistic Society of America's annual meeting, but like subset of that, the American Dialect Society's Word of the Year situation, where a bunch of linguists lobby and fight nicely sometimes
Usually
over
nicely,
what
yeah.
usually nicely over what the Word of the Year should be. So you did this interview a few years ago for the Slovenian Linguistics Journal, and you kind of talked about your sort of journey from, I guess, like more formal linguistics, structural linguistics in college to more cultural and
Hmm.
anthropological linguistics in grad school. And I guess let's start there. Like, what is a word to you? What is language to you? Do you see it as a structuralist? Do you approach it like a structuralist, like Saussure, like Bloomfield, or are you more Bakhtin and like one of the heteroglossia fans? What is,
Um,
and feel free
I
to
think
define what is
I
language
think
to you?
you I think you can be all of those things. I don't
Okay.
think you have to limit yourself to any one particular theoretical approach. And you know, I did start in a sort of as a linguistics major undergrad at Yale, and studying sort of formal linguistics. But by the end of that experience, I was already being drawn over into linguistic anthropology over in the anthropology department, working with a professor there, Joe Arrington, who ended up sort of being my undergraduate advisor. It ended up also being why I ended up doing field work in Indonesia, and sort of taking Indonesian, the national language, and then studying a regional language called Sundanese, which I studied in graduate school. And so, yeah, I mean that was sort of my journey. I ended up at University of Chicago for linguistic anthropology and soaking up all of these different theoretical approaches and understanding, what was that structuralist approach that Saussure and then Bloomfield ended up bringing to American linguistics. But then, yeah, being exposed to all of these other theoretical traditions that you could sort of put into your toolbox, into your repertoire, and that could be literary theory, or it could be Bakhtin, for instance, who I was very much drawn to. And the thing that perhaps intrigued me the most about Bakhtin, and just reading, there was Rabelais in his world, and then there was the great collection of essays on the dialogic imagination, this idea of heteroglossia, that instead of just sort of thinking of language as this formal system, you could think of it as all of these sort of multiple voicings, and it's sort of shot through with it, and to pick apart any stretch of language use, you have to understand all of these things at once, and from the perspective of the speaker or writer of the language, but then everything involving sort of all of the context of history and politics and so forth. And that excited me a lot, to sort of think of it as this sort of vibrant system that was not simply just sort of a closed formal loop or anything like that, but that could really encompass the whole world, basically, and in any given utterance or any given, stretch of language. And so you can even say that about the lowly word. And I mean, that's kind of what has driven my writing, at least, when I look at a particular word or phrase. I'm not going to get into any nitpicky argument about what constitutes a word, because that's pointless as far as I'm concerned. Um, my training in lexicography has led me to appreciate what constitutes a lexical item, which is at least a little bit easier to pinpoint than the nebulous concept of the word. But yeah, what I do these days in terms of my language column for the Wall Street Journal and writing elsewhere, I tend to think of as a kind of narrative lexicography, where you can talk about the life of a word or phrase, and from the earliest known use to the present day, and all the different cultural worlds that it may run through. And you can tell this very sort of interesting story that necessitates dipping into all of these things like history and politics and everything to understand the context of use and what it means to people, why it's significant, thinking about it, meta-linguistically, perhaps when it becomes something that rises to salience or to the people's consciousness of a particular word, especially if it's controversial in some way. It might be controversial because it's politically charged in a certain way in our discourse, or even just because people have certain peeves about the way language works. But a lot of language writing focuses on those peeves. I try to understand the peeves without being too focused on those, because as far as I'm concerned, every word in a language, every lexical item, whatever you want to call it, in a language can open up a whole story, a whole narrative that allows you to, again, sort of think about various intersecting cultural worlds. So even though I'm long removed from my graduate school days at University of Chicago, I still think back about some of those, theoretical approaches that I was lucky to really get a grounding in. They may not like directly inform things I write. I'm not, citing Bakhtin in my Wall Street Journal column, although maybe I should.
You should,
but
yeah.
but it's there in the background. It's always informing, the way that I write, the way that I think about language.
Yeah. What I like about people like Bakhtin is that they, I think, more so are sympathetic to the idea that we are actually like autonomous agents over language. We have
Right.
power over how it changes
Hmm.
and what it means, rather than
Hmm.
like we are somehow like indoctrinated into, I mean, we are in some ways, like it's hard to play with syntax in ways that actually end up changing things. But like actually we have a lot of power and we're changing language
Yeah,
all the time, and it's
absolutely.
shifting and moving.
Agency.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
it's
so
great.
much, I know. And it's very political, as you
Absolutely.
said, right?
Yeah.
So I want to ask about, there's a lot of, well, at least this year at the Word of the Year ceremony, there's a lot of discussion of like where these words are coming from and
Right.
how they get popular and from what
Right.
community they come from. A
Hmm.
lot of our quote unquote slang words originate from African American English.
Hmm.
So like, words like slay and spill the tea and expressions like that, they have this longer process, one could say, of kind of getting into a place where they're
Yep.
in the like more mainstream white lexicon, as opposed to the lesser mainstream lexicon of people of more marginalized identities. And I think, yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on sort of like what do we do with that to kind of realize that a lot of our words that are kind of like on pitch originally come from communities that maybe we're not a part of. This year, cunty was on the line and
Hmm.
or like on the line, and people were like, "This is not a word that comes from the community of most people, the majority, maybe not anyone in this room."
Right.
And there's a discussion of that. So yeah,
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's something that we always have to sort of be aware again of the cultural roots of a lot of what we consider new has a
yeah,
history which may not be legible to people who sort of think of it as, oh, this is the latest Gen Z slang. And in fact, this supposed Gen Z
right,
slang is simply, various kinds of lexical appropriations, let's say, of that may come from African American English, sometimes specifically subculture like drag culture, where we're talking about sort of like, the pioneers are very often, trans
yeah,
African Americans. And these are marginalized communities that don't get the credit for a lot of the sort of cultural innovation and linguistic innovation necessarily, unless there are folks who are there to say, hey, let's look at where this language is actually coming from. Why does it get this particular mainstream pickup where mainstream basically gets coded as that's white basically, or
yeah,
young white
yeah.
people discover
White
it.
or
Yeah,
cis or straight.
exactly.
I mean, there's a lot like
Exactly.
at play of words.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think there's a greater awareness and sensitivity to all of that. And my concern with Word of the Year and that sort of thing is that at times we can run the risk of treating these things too glibly simply because we're like, hey, here are the nominations for Word of the Year, and this is what they mean. And we might, say a little bit about where they come from, but we need to sort of really be giving that kind of rich cultural history for all of these terms. And again, that's what we try to do with Among the New Words, where we have installments where we just go through the nominations, the nominees for the various categories in Word of the Year, and we do both a kind of a discursive treatment of a paragraph or two talking about each of these things, and then we do a full kind of historical lexicographical treatment as the supplemental material, which you will find online for the online version of the journal, where we're giving this kind of OED style, citational evidence going back
That's
to the
Oxford English
yes, Oxford
Dictionary.
English
Yeah, yeah.
Dictionary. Yes, that's right. Oxford English Dictionary being this sort of historical approach in historical lexicography, where you define the word, define its various senses, but then try to give a full accounting based on
Yeah.
citational evidence of the earliest known use through its various incarnations. And even for words and phrases and other items, because we treat other things like emoji, for instance, which are kind of crazy to treat lexicographically. With all of these things, you can build a kind of historical record that tries to be as accurate as possible. But there are various limitations even with that. So for what we call slang and forms of that more informal colloquial nature, obviously it can exist in oral use and spoken use long before it gets written down. There are ways to kind of try to fill out that picture a little better. And these days, again, with new social media, that is less of a concern because people are, first of all, recording themselves using things a lot more now and sharing them with the world. But also the text that is being generated, even when it's written text, typed text, is very much more sort of shot through with things that we might have previously considered not appropriate for standard written English or something like that. So we have so much at our disposal now in order to be able to track these things. It still requires work, though. It still requires work to really try to paint an accurate picture of what are the cultural worlds that generate these new forms, and how do they cross over in various ways. And so one thing that I think that what we're trying to accomplish, at least in this sort of fuller accounting in the Among the New Words feature, is to combat the various types of erasure that we see going on, where it could be, again, African American culture or other marginalized sources that do not get the kind of the credit that they deserve in terms of where this innovation is coming from and why it becomes appealing. And again, there are various reasons for why you could say that these particular firms get the kind of the cultural pickup that they do, why certain things seem cool enough to be something that you'd want to incorporate if you're a young person looking for the types of language that might indicate a kind of in-group identity, as sociolinguists like to think about it.
Covert prestige,
Yeah,
one would say.
exactly.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
sometimes an anti-prestige becomes the new prestige.
Yeah.
That's the sort of like the anti-language approach when we sort of think about things that are
Yeah.
actually oppositional to standard language are the things that have the most appeal at times. And then, of course, when things do go mainstream and start entering dictionaries and get used by older folk and people on TV or whatever, that signals kind of the death of that cultural cachet because the wrong people are using it now.
Right. Yeah. I want to say with, you're saying emojis and stuff. I feel like it's so interesting. It's why not though?
Right.
It's a semiotic resource. It's a sign,
Exactly.
to this year, the watermelon emoji
Mhm.
being sort of this signal for the Palestinian flag because it has the same colors. And because people are finding that when you have the Palestinian flag on things, you get taken down sometimes by Instagram. So using that to kind of again, index a certain political allegiance. I think that's
that's a great example. And in fact, it won the category for political word of the year. I'm putting word in quotation marks. But watermelon emoji, that was extremely prominent and one that, again, kind of tells a fascinating story in terms of culture and politics and history. And so, in fact, we're doing a special themed installment of Among the New Words coming up for the I guess it will be the May 2024 issue of American Speech that focuses on algospeak. And
Yeah.
so algospeak is this, this term that's come up for the various kind of often kind of evasive maneuvers that have to be made in order to outwit the algorithms and other ways that basically speech can, or language can become dangerous politically sometimes, or it can just simply be something where you want to avoid people searching for a particular use of, again, it could be a lexical item or it could even be an emoji.
Yeah, I mean, we should get
So
specific. I
yeah,
mean, like I'll go speak, I
yeah,
think largely came about because people were trying to talk about sex and Instagram was saying, don't say porn.
right,
So people said
right.
corn and then started using the corn
Right.
emoji.
Corn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a great example. And so, yeah, we dig into all of this stuff that with the help of Kendra Calhoun and Alexia Fawcett, who have become kind of the experts on algo speak. They did a great presentation at the LSA and now have an article out that kind of comes out of their research. And we brought them on board to sort of help us out and try to understand algo speak and dig into some of these things. So yeah. So very often, again, it's sort of filters that are placed on various platforms, which then have to be evaded in various clever ways. And those clever evasive maneuvers are ones that, again, have been used historically in various ways, whether, people finding different ways to, take a form and change it subtly, perhaps just changing a letter like porn to corn, or using various other techniques in order to sort of get around these things. So the watermelon emoji is an interesting example of that because, again, long before emoji existed, the watermelon itself was this kind of icon going back to the 1960s for Palestinians. There's a history of watermelon in Levantine cuisine, but then at a time when the Palestinian flag was banned by the Israeli government,
Yeah.
then using this as a kind of a stand-in, which, as it happens, has these similar colors, that sort of carried over into online usage with the watermelon emoji becoming this new symbol of solidarity. And so, yeah, I mean, again, just something like that where the emoji as a particular kind of signifier and thinking of the semiotics of that and thinking of all that just can be wrapped up in just somebody using that particular emoji, making that choice. And again, sort of getting back to sort of the agency, it is about what you're choosing to put out there in the world. Why this rather than something else that you could do? And sort of thinking about those individual choices and what goes into that. And yeah, just as much for emoji as any other bit of our sort of semiotic landscape.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor the point, but like semiotic landscape. I mean, go back historically to like how gay people would signal to each. I mean, like ear piercing, like piercing one ear versus two. Like semiotics goes like so far back in
Or
terms of like how.
handkerchiefs. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah, for
whatever.
sure. Like what are we signaling and how are we signaling it?
Right.
And is it conscious and is it a choice? And it's not a word, but it's still something that indexes something. It's a signifier.
Exactly.
So we've been like going here to the political thing, but you are so often called upon by the news to speak about politics. And I find this really fascinating because plenty of linguists can speak about the political nature of their research. Like this is not new, but yet you're on CNN to discuss impeachment hearings or Kavanaugh being what he is or things of that nature. And you gave this talk in 2017 at the LSA meeting called Traveling Among the New Words, Lexical Adventures in the Digital Age, in which you kind of went on this whole thing of like how certain words that are used in these political contexts can be then recontextualized, resignified. So nasty woman is said by Trump, and then suddenly people reappropriate that and take that and they say, no, I'm reclaiming that like I'm a nasty woman. Binders full of women. I hadn't heard that one in a long time. I was like, binders full
That
of women.
takes you back. Yeah. Wow.
I haven't heard that in forever. I mean, like, I'm gonna have to put like the explicit button on this episode, but like when Samantha Bee called Ivanka Trump a feckless cunt, like that was a moment, right? Like, so I don't know why are first off, like why do you think you're so often called upon to really speak about politics? But then what is going on here? Like I was kind of fascinated as to why you were on CNN talking about in both impeachment hearings and Kavanaugh in terms of like why congressmen are yelling, like, or well, just Congress people in general, but it was men yelling at the hearings. I mean, Lindsey Graham was doing this whole histrionic thing of like, this is not a job interview, this is hell. Like, well, you did sexually assault someone, so lol. But
Yeah,
yeah, the political nature of language when it's used, not just
right.
what it is. Yeah.
Well, yeah. It's interesting. As I became kind of a language commentator, I often try to think about the politics of language. Again, even in my graduate work and doing work on, Indonesian and Sundanese language,
Yeah.
very often I was talking about the politics of language. I wrote a whole thesis about kind of subversive wordplay, which it could be used in Indonesia during the New Order regime to kind of subvert the power of Suharto in that era. So, like, the politics of language was always something that fascinated me. And as I kind of tried to develop a voice as a language commentator, I realized that what people often want to hear about is words and phrases and linguistic aspects that are politically salient over, a particular issue that might be going on. Again, it could be Supreme Court hearings. It could be, again, the things that come up in campaigning and other things. And so certainly during the Trump era, this kept me very busy, and I did a lot for The Atlantic and Politico. I'm doing less of that these days, but certainly the Trump era lent itself very well to that kind of discussion. Coming in right away with alternative facts and just sort of taking it from there. So yeah, I guess that when I'm sort of called upon to talk about these things again, I'm trying to again sort of try to contextualize things, why these particular, again, linguistic or lexical aspects might sort of rise to something that we want to obsess over and talk about on news networks and so forth. And so, yeah, very often we're talking about particular politically charged words. These days, we could be talking about ceasefire, for instance, as an example of a politically charged word, and certainly one that came up in our word of the year discussions, where there's again a kind of a meta-linguistic discourse that goes around these kind of key terms that enter our political awareness, and again sort of get shot through with these voicings, again, to go back to Bakhtin, and the way that kind of recontextualization and then recontextualization can happen so quickly. You were talking about the nasty woman phenomenon, and on the other side of that equation in 2016, of course, we had the basket of deplorables, where Hillary used that term, and then within hours you've got the MAGA types with their deplorable T-shirts and so forth.
As they should.
So,
Yeah.
right, but I mean, it's this type of thing where now that whole process is just accelerated to the degree that, again, it can happen just in the space of hours, where something becomes kind of emblematized, let's say. Another great example of that, of course, is the "Let's Go Brandon" phenomenon again. So where the story there is that there is this NASCAR race, and an NBC reporter, she was talking to the winner of the race, who happened to be named Brandon. There were chants of "fuck you Biden" going on, which she misheard as "Let's Go Brandon," thinking that they were rooting on the winner of that race. That then became this sort of figure of play, where "Let's Go Brandon" ended up becoming this sort of euphemized version of like an anti-Biden sentiment, which then gets recontextualized again by the pro-Biden forces, and then we get all of these wonderful spin-offs like "Dark Brandon," where you get images of Joe Biden with lasers shooting out of his eyes, which again is sort of taking MAGA imagery and reclaiming it in this new way, and sort of seeing that bouncing back and forth like that, where for you to understand, where even like Joe Biden uses this dark Brandon imagery in his social media now, to even sort of understand all the layers that go into that, into something like that, where again it's these voicings and sort of shooting it back and forth across various types of ideological divides. So much of our political discourse is like that now, where to unpack it requires a lot of work, and it requires like sort of like stepping back and thinking, okay, so how did this emerge? How did it get picked up by Group A? How did Group B react to that? How did it sort of through memes or what have you, perhaps develop layers of irony that you have to sort of figure out before you can even appreciate where it's coming from. And very often these again are playful uses of language and other semiotic forms, where the language play involves saying, I'm going to take this bit of language and make it my own, put my own spin on it as a way sometimes to spoof or satirize the side that you are opposing. Again, Bakhtin is very helpful for understanding these things, where he talks about like carnivalesque inversions of where, you could take official language and give it a kind of unofficial meaning. And again, like I was talking about the subversive wordplay in Indonesia that I wrote about in grad school, that was sort of very useful in thinking about those things. But yeah, but very, very often it requires just kind of like a broader view of how these things work in our landscape of political language. And, very often that can be very, very complicated. So I see my role as kind of helping to unpack that in a way that, again, becomes more legible for people to understand exactly how these, forces work in terms of creating the various sort of cultural environments that allow for the kind of innovations to happen. And again, it can be just people, playing with language, but calling it language play may make it sound frivolous when in fact it can have very kind of profound political ramifications and how you are playing with those languages, and like we were saying, can become emblematic of an entire political group just in the way you are playing with
Yeah.
language in a certain way, sort of taking signifiers and resignifying them. So yeah, so I mean that sometimes is a bit too nuanced to explain on a TV show or radio show or podcast, but I do
Yeah.
try to pick apart these things and just, really sort of get into the complexity of how much can go into something like that, rather than again just sort of like thinking of these things as buzzwords or things that sort of like come into our consciousness because we're hearing them from political candidates or what have you. It's sort of again sort of thinking more seriously about where all of this comes from.
I kind of wanted to ask more on this political line. So the word of the year in 2022 was ussy, this suffix
Mhm.
libfix, which annoys me to no end as a living, breathing human woman in this world who considers herself a feminist, because people are obsessed with the fact
Mhm.
that this ussy, this like comes from pussy, subfix libfix, is the word of the year, and no one else previously or afterwards cares about the word of the year. No one is like, oh, enshittification is the word of the year. Ben Zimmer, please explain this to us, because it's like, why do you care so much
Right.
that ussy was word of the year, right? And I think that I've also been a little bit upset in the way that it's been defined as like, oh, you can just take it and add it to something else to like draw attention to like if something has a hole. Well, it's not just a hole. Like, we're not just taking
Mhm.
throat and ussy and making thrusy and talking about, like, no one's referring to their throat as thrusy in all contexts. That's only being referred to as thrusy in contexts that are sexual. No one's like, oh my God, I have a
Mhm.
cold this week, my thrusy hurts. Like, that's not something that you could say felicitously. You could make a joke about blowjobs and say something about thrusy. So I don't know. This you
Yeah.
really got a lot of airtime out of ussy, which, like, good for you,
Well,
great.
not in
Yeah.
not on CNN, that's for
Oh,
sure,
sure, yeah.
or in the New York Times. It's funny because this most recent year when we picked enshittification, there was a New York Times reporter on the scene who ended up writing a very nice kind of recap of the whole thing. Did a great job with it. Her name is Sam Corbin. And I have to give major props to Sam because she managed to convince her editors to actually have enshittification expurgated in the pages of the New York Times, and that's
Yeah.
that's good to see. It tells us something about sort of the changing nature of some of these taboos. The year before that, as you say, it was ussy, which I learned from Sam was something that the Times had been considering covering, but they kind of shied away from it. They're like, we're going to give this a pass.
Right. How dare we? How dare we speak about that? Yeah.
Right. That was
Yeah, yeah,
seen
yeah.
as off limits. That was seen as too taboo for the New York Times, or I should say, the Wall Street Journal, where I write. I wasn't about to write a column about it without recognizing I would get sort of major pushback from my editors. I mean, these are the kind of strictures that we work with in major media publications. But so with ussy, it was interesting because, we chose ussy. I tweeted it out as I do every year on the American Dialect Society Twitter. It was still Twitter at the time, Twitter account,
Yeah.
linking to the press release, totally mild-mannered thing. And that went more viral than anything that I will ever be involved in. And in part, sort of thinking back on that more than a year later, why was there so much interest? Why was it this thing that just like zillions of people were sort of sharing and laughing about? In part, I think it was the fact that there is this group of language scholars, these serious linguists and language scholars, who had decided that ussy would be the word of the year, was this kind of comical mismatch of a sort. It was sort of the incongruity of it, I think, is what made it humorous. That this term, again, which when it's sort of getting used online, and less so these days than it was a year or two ago, but it is, as you say, very often, the sexual connotations, the taboo nature of it, that has to do with women's bodies, but in this particular way that, yeah, there's a sexualization that goes on, but where the idea that you can sort of sexualize anything
Yes.
that you are sort of morphologically attaching the ussy lib fix, as to use
Right.
Arnold Zwicky's term, to whatever you want to, and thereby sexualizing it in this particular way. That phenomenon on its
Right.
own was funny enough to people. Again, you can sort of like, why is it funny? But then the idea that it has this somehow official recognition as word of the year made it seem, for a lot of people who were already familiar with the term, thought that it was, hilarious that this outrageous bit of the language was getting some sort of like being anointed in this official way by a group of serious language scholars. That was the sense that I got. And then, even though the New York Times wouldn't write about it, Rolling Stone and other outlets did, ones that, where you could actually get away with talking about these things. And I saw it as an opportunity to sort of, again, talk about how these things do become so prominent that a group of language scholars would call it their word of the year, and also to talk about our whole process and how we do it. So Kelly Elizabeth Wright, who has taken on an important role in these word of the year selection processes now. We call her our data czar, because she takes in the nominations from the public and then sort of presents them when we have our nominating session to talk about, what is sort of interesting people at large, and like the way that the
Yeah.
folks who are voting can understand it. She had been sort of tracking the use of ussy and seeing that people nominating it and that sort of thing. And she had created for that year a whole, video talking about the nominations. This was because she wasn't able to attend that year. The LSA conference was a video that we shared at the nominating session, but then just had online on YouTube. And so because of the exposure from, the whole to-do over ussy, we sort of get this coverage in Rolling Stone, and they, even embed Kelly's video that she did where she's talking about this whole process. So like, even though for the most part, yeah, the whole thing sort of went viral in this way that kind of faded away very quickly. It didn't
Yeah.
necessarily bring in, a huge amount of like people sort of thinking about these things in a serious way. I do appreciate that was an opportunity to sort of put this out a little bit more in venues like Rolling Stone, that were willing to see it originally as, oh, this is very funny, but then what the heck is the story behind this? And then sort of to look into this a bit more and report it out. I appreciated that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I just want to clarify. It's like, it's not that ussy is the word of the year that's so upsetting. It's like the fact that people either refuse to acknowledge it, didn't want to talk about it because how dare we speak about women's bodies in that way. But then
Right.
also this idea that like we can, it's just about if something has a hole, a wine bottle, a
Right.
wussy or something. No, that's not what's going on here, right? You're consistently reducing like a woman's body to something that you can fuck. Like
Mm.
that is what is going on here. If the word of the year were phallic, New York Times would run with, I think they would run with that. That would be so awesome because we have such a veneration of like Alecness in this world. So like that is why I think it is like at least was upsetting to
Yeah.
me. As I was like, really? And then to have people be like, we can't have cunty be a word of the year. Well, like,
Mm.
why not? That actually is something that people are using to be empowered, to speak
Mm-hmm.
about something as it's cunty, as in it's like powerful and it's loud and it's out there and it's
Yeah.
unapologetic. And so, yeah, that's my little,
Well,
yeah.
again, I, as a dude, I'm not going to sort of weigh in any sort of mansplainy way on these issues. And I again try to avoid that as much as possible, even though again I'm called upon to explain things, in the case of like OC for word of the year. I I'm glad that again that the word of the year is a kind of a forum that allows for the sort of the free exchange of all sorts of different viewpoints on these things and really interesting discussions, really interesting debates. We, certainly had a lot of most recent time, whether it was about cunty or other terms. Again, the political stuff became pretty charged as well. But I mean, it all goes to what I was saying all along. It's like you can't just sort of think of these words and phrases as just items of the lexicon. I mean, it just sounds so sterile. I mean, the way that we can invest so much cultural power into these things and how wrapped up it can get into, again, issues of identity, issues of gender and race, ethnicity, and political sexual orientation. I mean, what you were saying about cunty, that obviously was expressed. There is a video that if you go to the American Dialect Society's YouTube channel, Grant Barrett put up a video. It's, we didn't have cameras or whatever. We just had sort of Grant's phone where he was like, had the podium with me and Kelly Wright and Jesse Greaser. But the audio, at least, you can hear everybody chiming in and talking about these words. And yeah, at times it got serious. I mean, it's like tonally, I think is what interests me is
Yeah.
that we can take this word of the year event, which feels fun. It's something I'm glad that people want to come to it. Like lots of young scholars who are attending the LSA conference. This is like something that they really want to go to. I'm glad that it has that appeal. At the same time, yeah, I mean, it's something it is both fun and serious at the same time. And I appreciate that the kind of the seriousness that people can bring to it at the same time that they're having fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just talk about when things got really like sort of more serious. I mean, the word context, right? If we think of the word
Right.
context as being somehow associated, which I don't totally agree with, the hearings with the Harvard and MIT and UPenn presidents around
Right.
Israel-Palestine conflict,
Hmm.
student protests and stuff, that got intense just because like there's a lot to be said there of the fact that when we make something the word of the year in whatever category, we're
Yeah,
crystallizing that, we're concretizing that into like
for sure.
somehow signifying something about whatever we are saying it signifies. And
Yeah.
yeah, people disagree and there's disagreement to be had. Ben Zimmer, would love to know what your favorite word is and why.
My favorite word. Oh, that's funny. I do I have a favorite word? It's trying to choose among your children or whatever. It's funny. It's like as a kid, sort of growing up with my head buried in unabridged dictionaries, the words that appealed to me when I was youngest were the ones that were just so outrageous that you're like, why do we even have a word for that? And so, obviously those aren't ones that I necessarily care about now. But, just as an example, a word that appears in one particular unabridged dictionary that I spent a lot of time paging through, Webster's New International Second Edition, the one that came out in the 1930s, had all of these words that they ended up taking out in future editions. And one of them was ucalagon, ucalegon, which means a neighbor whose house is on fire. And just the specificity of that, I mean, again, you could sort of, it has to do with some Greek myth or whatever, but just the idea that there exists a word for when you need it, when your neighbor's house is on fire, that you would be able to use just really appealed to me. And so for a long time, I would just say, if I was asked that, just like, okay, Legon. But, just from week to week, I feel like I get a new favorite. And so as we're recording this, my word of the week for the Wall Street Journal is a word that is my new current favorite, at least, until the next one comes along. And that is Herkel Durkel. Have you encountered Herkel Durkel?
I have not encountered Herkel Durkel. Please enlighten.
Okay, well, Herkeldurkel is an old Scottish term that's in Scottish dictionaries from the early 19th century. It's a dialectal term just from Fife, just this one particular part of Eastern Scotland. And it basically means it can be a noun or a verb, but as a verb, it means to lie around in bed when you're supposed to get up. And this particular term has now become one of the trendy words of 2024. And it's a delightful word, of course, Herkeldurkel. But how in the world is Herkeldurkel now being used on TikTok and other social media? How did we get to this point? And so this is the type of fun story that I get to trace in my column. This word again is only in dictionaries of the Scots language and Scottish sources, but there's a British lexicographer named Susie Dent who is a bit of a celebrity, she's a real celebrity in the UK. And so everybody in the UK knows Susie Dent. And she sort of parlayed that celebrity she does into like a hefty social media presence. She's got like 1 million followers on Twitter/X. And she enjoys kind of like reviving old words that, like why aren't we using this old word anymore? And she often does like a word of the day. And Herkeldurkel is just one of her favorite words. And she's sort of shared that word in the past. And it just so happened that, something that she tweeted out in 2016 about how wonderful this word is and sort of the joy of Herkeldurkeling, using this 200-year-old Scottish word, then got picked up where people would sort of take the text of what she said on Twitter and create an image with the text of that. And, happiness is Herkeldurkeling and that sort of thing. And then that got shared on Instagram, Facebook, and so forth. And that caught the eye of a young an actor/singer. Her name is Kira Kosarin. Gen Z folks, I guess, would know her from her Nickelodeon show, The Thundermans. And she's now in a movie based on that. She has millions and millions. I think like 30 million followers on TikTok, and she's a hardcore word nerd. And so when she saw Herkeldurkel, she loved it, and she did her own TikTok on it, and talking about how everybody loves a Herkeldurkel, and why this is so applicable to everybody's lives. And so now you get like, it's gotten to the point where there are think pieces in the Huffington Post because they always want to sort of like keep track of the latest TikTok trends and saying, oh, Herkeldurkeling is the new TikTok trend, but should you, worry about how much you Herkeldurkel? And just because you give this funny word to something, you don't want to overdo it. And there are all these other terms that people use for lying in bed on the weekend or whatever, like bed rotting is this other term, which is a lot less interesting or a lot less fun to say, let's say, than Herkeldurkeling.
I would say aesthetically appealing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's my favorite word of the moment, just because it's like, it's just the idea that this obsolete dialectal Scottish term, which granted is very fun to say, it's got rhyming reduplication. I mean, and it's just a great word. And Susie Dent really sort of picked up on one that she knew that people would enjoy just because there's a kind of a pleasure in saying it, and it kind of gives you license to appreciate this thing, which that everybody can again appreciate. Like why not just sort of lie in bed a little longer when you're supposed to get up. So it ties into this very relatable experience. People like the idea. It's like, oh, there's a word for this thing. Again, it's very often how people sort of like appeal to the dictionary in order to sort of say, this is something that is in the dictionary, and therefore, it's something that has some legitimacy to it. So the idea that, there is a word out there, even though it's this word that comes from a couple centuries ago from Fife, is something that I'm just fascinated that the way that language can travel again through one particular lexical item, the kind of the journey that it's been on and how it can be reinvented and rediscovered. It's just, I know that I will never run out of things to write about. When I see something like that, I see, oh, Herkeldurkel is big. It's like, why? Oh, okay. And so whether it's new words coming to the language, like we talked about rizz, or whether it's a revival of some older form, people are always going to innovate. They're always going to sort of create new things, find new semantic pathways for these things. and it keeps me in business. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, and yeah, as you just said, like, you go on social media, that increases the diversity of who you're like listening in on, right?
True.
Honestly, with their permission. I mean, it's public,
Yep.
but that does, I mean, it's
Right.
not like rapid and anonymous like back in the
Yeah,
day.
that's key. And yeah, the diversity of voices that, I mean, it's interesting too, because the algorithms are set up very often to just kind of show you what you want to see, right? And that's been so much that's been written about, algorithms on whether it's, TikTok or Instagram or whatever. And that can have a kind of that can create a kind of like a tunnel vision, perhaps, where you're not being exposed to other voices. But the fact that they're out there, if you get sort of break out from beyond the what the algorithms are choosing to put on your For You page or what have you, is really key. And yeah, it means that the documentation of language change can encompass a lot more diversity where again that might have been difficult to get a handle on before. So that's important. But yeah, like I said, I mean, because sometimes there's a sort of siloing effect, where you just, your profile has been determined by the algorithm and that's what you're going to see. That kind of the sort of limitations on the consumption of that media, you have to kind of be aware of that as well. Even at the same time, you feel like there's this vast landscape that, and if you're looking for things, you can find it, although you can't necessarily always find it, as we discovered when we did the installment on algo speak for Among the New Words. Really successful algo speak is going to be hard for even us to find, because the whole point is like very often you're trying to make it not something you can search for. You can still search for say a watermelon emoji. The various platforms allow you to search on emoji, for instance, but there are other types of things where you may be sort of coming up with something that is evading people searching for it, and that obviously is something that we have to be aware of, because what's available to us and what's sort of legible for us to even talk about, and when we're documenting these things, are things that we can search for, right? So that's something I think about a lot too, in terms of just the work I do, even for writing the Wall Street Journal column. One reason I feel like I can tell stories about any particular word or phrase is because I can search for them now in a kind of targeted searching on databases of newspapers and books and magazines and so forth, in a way that is, now possible to do, rather than just being like, well, the Oxford English Dictionary says such and such. And now it can be like, well, back in the 1920s, this sports writer was using all sorts of like funny expressions, and this got picked up in a comic strip and blah blah blah. And very often it's those kind of like pop culture type sources like that, where language that is new and innovative is allowed to thrive. And perhaps before, 100 years ago, that would have been sports writers and comic strip artists who were the ones who were doing it. Now, of course, that extends to everyone. Basically, has the ability to sort of like put that creative and innovative language out there in the world.
So, Ben Zimmer, first off, thank you so much for joining me today. My last question for you is, why linguistics? Why language? Interpret this however you like.
Sure. I mean, it's funny. I mean, when I think back to, again, being a linguistics major undergrad, it's sort of what appealed to me is always just sort of like how this thing that we all may sort of take for granted has this kind of hidden structure to it. I mean, again, that's like, even though I got away from formal linguistics, the idea of, like when you take your syntax class and you start talking about, from the generative approach, you start talking about, deep structures and surface structures, and you start thinking it's like, oh, this whole machinery that nobody even thinks about, and they somehow just learn it when they're young. It's like, this miraculous thing that happens with every person who learns language or languages, in the case of bilingual, multilingual people. And again, even if I sort of, as a young person, sort of thought of it as just like words in a dictionary, and that's something that I've returned to in sort of the things I do more lexicographically. Just the whole picture of what language does just fascinates me to no end. And I've been lucky to kind of have mentors along the way who have kind of, fostered this in a way. So, when I got to University of Chicago, my advisor is Michael Silverstein. And all of the sort of theoretical underpinnings we were talking about, again, it's like, it's the sort of the Silversteinian approach to be like, yes, we're going to, in his famous language in culture class, we're going to talk about Saussure, we're going to talk about Bloomfield and these whole traditions, but we're also going to, bring in all of these other things like Bakhtin, for instance. I mean, that's what I owe it all to. And something that Michael Silverstein talked about was, he called it at one time the total linguistic fact. And basically that encompasses, the structure or form, the use of language. So, if Saussure, it's like, langue and parole or whatever, but we're talking about structure as well. It's like the pragmatics of use. And then the ideology, the way that all of this is mediated by cultural ideology, and how you can't just treat any of these things in isolation. It is the total linguistic fact. You have to sort of think about it holistically, and that also means bringing in all of these kind of theoretical approaches that help you get a handle on these things. And again, whether it's Bakhtin or
Peirce.
semiotics from Peirce, exactly.
Peirce is like the most important.
Right, exactly. Right. So the whole idea that Silverstein developed of indexicality comes from him learning about Peirce from Roman Jakobson, was a teacher of his at Harvard. And, so I feel very lucky to have been able to kind of experience that. And even though I didn't stay in academia, it still, like I said, kind of informs my thinking about language and keeps me always kind of trying to remain intellectually open in terms of, again, different approaches to language that you can take. And hopefully I can inspire people to do the same.
Yeah, I love that. Like, I genuinely, like, you have no idea how much that answer, how like amazing I think that was. I mean, I think that's the first time someone's like invoked like all of those names in one answer before. I mean, certainly you talked before about like the total linguistic fact and how you really cannot, you can't silo any aspect of language. That for me, it's just been so important to think about, is like, I'm so glad that I do literary theory. I'm so glad that I read Peirce so much, because that's what language does, right? Because as much as we know about what Saussure taught us or what Chomsky taught us, what we just already know, and just being aware of what it does and what it affects and what it signifies and what it indexes, first and second and thirdness, as we know, is so important. I just can't tell you how much that answer like really means. I mean, to think of language in all of its parts, but really give credence to enregisterment and indexicality and the political nature of it. And by doing so, then you give credence to like the technicalities of prosody and things like that. But
that's right. You do. Yeah. You don't ignore any of it. That's what I learned. And that, in a sense, is a problem with linguistics, with a capital L.
Yes.
That is just sort of like treating, again, the langue of langue and parole, for instance, and not even let alone the sort of the ideological part of it and the metalinguistic, metapragmatics, as Silverstein would say. But yeah, you have to sort of widen your lens and think about these things in their totality and holistically to really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I have been your host, as always, Talia Sherman, and that was my conversation with the amazing and just brilliant guy in general, Ben Zimmer. You can check out his weekly column for the Wall Street Journal by checking out the Wall Street Journal or any of his social media platforms. They're highly engaging, and I recommend following all the stuff that he's working on. As always, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, and most importantly, pass along the podcast. It would be much appreciated, and I will speak to you next time, when I'm joined by the current Rappaport Fellow at Harvard Law School, Alex Walker. Bye.